Opening the center establishes immediate influence and prepares piece development for central control. Developing a knight towards the center establishes central influence and prepares for potential pawn breaks. Asserting central influence, this advance immediately probes the king's flank and prepares to wrestle for dominion over the core of the board. Challenging the center immediately, c5 fights for space and opens lines, often leading to sharp imbalances. Pushing the pawn opens lines and creates a central outpost, but also potentially isolates it. Challenging white's central pawn chain with a pawn sacrifice opens dynamic lines and creates immediate tactical possibilities. Developing the knight to a central square bolsters white's queenside pawn control and prepares for further piece activity. Opening the center this way can lead to sharp exchanges, so stay sharp and calculate carefully. Opening the c-file now sets up potential pressure against black's queenside pawn structure. Solidifying the central pawn chain now opens lines for black's pieces and prepares for a fight for the d5 outpost. Developing the knight to f3 reinforces control over the central squares and prepares for castling, offering a solid foundation for white's attacking ambitions. Unlocking the bishop's diagonal for unleashed pressure, this move signals a commitment to a fianchetto strategy, potentially creating an imposing dark square presence. Steering the knight towards the kingside, white aims to reinforce the pawn chain's base and prepare for an eventual kingside initiative, possibly involving a kingside pawn storm or a strategic repositioning of forces. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain, the knight embarks on a repositioning journey, aiming to support the kingside advance or contest central squares, offering flexibility while solidifying black's structure against white's central influence. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure prepares for a fianchetto, aiming to build a solid defensive barrier while simultaneously developing the bishop to its ideal long diagonal, creating harmonious piece play. Developing the bishop to this diagonal immediately addresses the pawn chain and prepares to castle, aiming for a secure king position while also eyeing the central dark squares that white might try to exploit. Developing the bishop to its best diagonal, where it now surveys the kingside and supports the central advance, solidifies white's grip on the queenside space and prepares to castle, ensuring king's safety while maintaining active piece play. Securing the monarch is paramount here. Castling efficiently tucks the king away and prepares for potential future pawn storms by activating the rook. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, and casting allows the king to escape the open files and connect the rooks, setting up future central play and potential defensive consolidation. Unlocking the queen's potential towards the kingside, this maneuver simultaneously bolsters the central pawn chain's stability and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, hinting at future attacking ambitions. Securing the kingside pawn structure against potential advances is the immediate objective, preventing any future g5 ideas from black and creating a defensive shield. Expanding the queenside with b6 subtly prepares to challenge white's central control by potentially activating the queenside bishop and creating dynamic play along the a7-g1 diagonal. Gaining space on the queenside with the pawn push to a4 immediately challenges black's queenside pawn structure, potentially aiming to expand white's influence in that sector and restrict black's development. Asserting pressure on the c4 pawn and eyeing the weak d5 square, the bishop's sortie to a6 immediately challenges white's queenside pawn structure and initiates a dynamic maneuvering game. Realigning the rook to the central file after the pawn exchange creates a solid defensive structure, preparing for potential pawn pushes or piece maneuvering in the coming skirmishes. Shifting the knight to the edge of the board initiates a fascinating repositioning, aiming to free the d-pawn and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside later, while simultaneously challenging white's queenside pawn structure. The knight's hop to b5 aggressively probes the queen's nascent defensive structure on a6, intending to disrupt black's queenside expansion and potentially target the weak c7 square, creating imbalances. The exchange of bishop for knight here dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a robust central outpost for white's knight on d5 that is no longer challenged by its counterpart. Black has gained a temporary tempo on the knight and opened the a-file, but at the cost of allowing white's d-pawn to solidify its dominance and gain valuable central space. This could lead to a strategic battle where black attempts to undermine white's pawn chain from the flanks, while white seeks to exploit the positional advantages of their superior central control. Reclaiming the central pawn opens a vital diagonal for the queen and asserts presence on the now more accessible a-file, creating dynamic potential for future piece activity. Black repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to challenge white's control of the central dark squares and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the queen side. Unlocking the c-file pressure, this queen deployment forces a decisive response from black's bishop, potentially creating lasting weaknesses. Black consolidates the knight's position, anchoring it on a potentially more active square in the center, and preparing for a future kingside advance or a central pawn push. Relocating the knight to b1, though seemingly passive, aims to regroup and defend the c3 square while preparing a potential b4 pawn push, exerting pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and potentially opening lines for white's rooks. Rerouting the knight to c7 aimed to contest the queenside, but now after the knight's return to f6, this rook's journey to b8 is a strategic regrouping, preparing to contest the b-file or potentially support a queenside pawn push, a subtle maneuver to gain some breathing room on the edge of the board. Reshaping the central pawn structure and preparing to contest crucial central squares, white recenters the knight, aiming to improve its position from the rim and potentially support advances on the queen side or in the center. Seizing the initiative on the queen side, this ambitious thrust aims to shatter white's pawn structure and open lines for counterplay against the exposed b2 pawn. It immediately challenges white's control over the queenside territory, forcing a reaction and potentially creating weaknesses that black can exploit later. Unlocking the c4-c5 pawn lever, this bishop retreat prepares a potent central thrust and supports the knight's potential advance towards e5, aiming to seize control of the open files. Suddenly, the queen side opens up, creating a new avenue for piece play that black hopes to exploit for counterplay. Exploiting black's misplaced knight and weakened queenside pawn structure, this knight jump forcefully contests the central squares and opens up multiple attacking avenues. Reclaiming the pawn creates a symmetrical pawn structure, but it does so by handing white control of the crucial d4 square and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This simplifies the position, but the knight's relocation to c7 might prove passive, sacrificing central influence for material recovery. Consider how this exchange impacts piece activity going forward. Can black generate sufficient threats on the queen side or elsewhere to compensate for the diminished central presence? Reclaiming the queen to the center asserts dominance over the b5 square and prepares for potential skirmishes across the queen side. White now eyes the open files and seeks to exploit black's somewhat passive placement of the rooks. Initiating a knight maneuver from its somewhat passive post on d7, this repositioning to e5 aims to challenge white's central pawn chain and potentially create attacking prospects on the king side. Black seeks to activate this knight, which has been restricted by its own pawns, and explore tactical possibilities that might arise from its new central square. White repositions the bishop, a quiet maneuver aiming to improve its scope and influence over the long diagonal, potentially pressuring black's queenside structure should an opportunity arise. Pushing the h-pawn signals an intent to break open the king side, perhaps targeting a weakness around white's potentially exposed monarch. This aggressive maneuver aims to create dynamic imbalances, potentially sacrificing pawn structure for attacking chances, especially if white's pieces are not perfectly positioned to repel the advance. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing to exert pressure along the open c-file is the primary objective here. Instead of passively defending, the bishop repositions to a more active square, aiming to coordinate with its comrades and potentially support a future advance of the c-pawn. This repositioning also aims to restrict black's piece mobility, particularly the knight on d7, forcing it to remain defensively oriented. The move anticipates black's potential pawn storm on the king side and seeks to create counterplay on the queen side, aiming to exploit any imbalances that arise. A patient approach is being adopted, focusing on incremental improvements and subtle maneuvering rather than immediate tactical fireworks. The bishop's new placement opens up the possibility of a rook lift on the king side later, adding another dimension to white's attacking potential. This is a strategic regrouping, setting the stage for a more ambitious central or queenside initiative. Relocating the queen to d8 is a curious retreat, perhaps eyeing the central files or preparing a repositioning maneuver. However, it seems to surrender tempo and allow white more freedom to organize their pieces, particularly the rook on the open c-file or the bishop on the long diagonal after further pawn pushes. Initiating a bold pawn thrust to seize more central space, this maneuver aims to restrict black's knight mobility and potentially open the f-file for future aggression, though it does create a slight pawn structure weakness on the king side. A bold thrust, this pawn push dramatically challenges the central pawn structure and immediately creates potential attacking avenues on the king side, though it also introduces a significant positional weakness on g6 that could be exploited later. Challenging the flank's newfound dynamism, this pawn thrust aims to seize breathing room and disrupt black's encroaching forces, potentially creating weaknesses around the castled king. Opening up lines on the queen side, black strikes at white's central structure, aiming to disrupt white's pieces and potentially exploit weaknesses that might arise from the pawn exchange. Opening the b-file offers immediate attacking potential, transforming a static pawn structure into an active asset for piece liberation and a potential pathway to the enemy king. Rethinking the pawn structure after the exchange on c3, this move endeavors to liberate the rook from its defensive duties on the queen side and activate it on the king side, seeking counterplay by opening lines towards white's monarch. Pivoting the queen to the queen side creates an immediate threat against the loose knight on d7, forcing black to respond to the pressure or risk material loss, while simultaneously preparing to re-establish piece activity on the king side. The knight, having retreated to a more defensive post, now surveys the board with a renewed focus on centralizing its influence and potentially supporting a queenside pawn advance. Unlocking the e-file initiates a crucial phase for white, aiming to fracture black's solid defensive structure and potentially expose their king. The rook finds a critical outpost on the c-file, eyeing the weakened c3 pawn and disrupting white's intended central advance. Asserting dominance on the 7th rank, white's queen now eyes the vulnerable b-pawn, potentially setting up a devastating discovered attack or simply squeezing black's position. Shifting the rook to the 2nd rank here is a bold attempt to reclaim some attacking initiative, but it surrenders valuable central control, potentially leaving your king exposed to further queenside pressure. Squeezing the black pieces with the queen and the pawns, the white queen repositions to patrol a crucial diagonal and eye potential weaknesses on the king side, while also preparing to swing over to the queen side where black's material advantage is less pronounced. Unlocking the queenside majority is the clear objective now, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's pawn structure. Seizing the open file with the rook clears the way for potential kingside pressure and a more active rook presence on the 7th rank. Recapturing the rook immediately addresses the material deficit, yet the resulting queenside pawn structure presents significant weaknesses. Initiating a rook lift to the 3rd rank prepares to contest the open file, aiming to activate the rook and potentially create threats along the ranks or support a pawn push. Black bravely injects dynamism into the pawn structure, creating immediate tension on the queen side and forcing white to make a difficult decision regarding the advanced passed pawn. The queenside structure is suddenly under immense pressure as this pawn sacrifice aims to unravel black's defenses. A desperate attempt to create a passed pawn on the queen side, sacrificing material for potential counterplay. Chasing that queen to the edge of the board opens up a fascinating dynamic, potentially exposing black's rook to pressure along the b-file and creating weaknesses around their castled king. Unlocking the queenside pawn structure with this capture creates fascinating new diagonal lines for your pieces, potentially threatening white's isolated pawn on a3 and creating immediate tension on the now open queenside. Repositioning the rook to the newly opened e-file aims to contest black's control and prepare for potential advances of the g-pawn, subtly shifting white's attention from the queenside skirmishes towards centralizing operations and creating pressure on black's pawn structure. Unleashing the passed pawn's power, this advance aims to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially create a decisive breakthrough on the queenside. Dislodging the enemy's queen pawn creates an open pathway for the rook, which now aims to contest the critical c-file, potentially forcing concessions or leading to exchanges that simplify towards a favorable endgame for white. The pawn structure, now irrevocably fractured by the recent exchanges, makes this queen maneuver a desperate attempt to exploit the open c-file. The king vacates its vulnerable post, seeking safety behind the pawn shield as the advanced passed pawn on c2 becomes a significant concern. Grasping at the poisoned pawn, black's rook ventures forward, a desperate gambit to disrupt white's regal sanctuary and perhaps ignite a counter-onslaught along the 7th rank. A timely repositioning of the queen to a more active square, threatening to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially create new attacking pathways, while simultaneously shoring up the king's defenses against any immediate infiltrations. Reactivating the rook to defend its passed pawn, though this might be a slight concession of central control. Hoping to exploit the now exposed king. Bringing the queen into the fray offers a new dynamic, threatening to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially fork pieces. Reclaiming the queen's diagonal control is paramount, aiming to disrupt black's advancing pawn and potentially trap the queen. The pawns advance to c4 rips open the queenside, creating immediate complications and challenging white's control over the d-file's influence. Reasserting queenside pressure, this repositioning aims to deny black's rook any breathing room on the now exposed c-file, preparing for a potential regrouping of white's forces to exploit the weakened pawn structure. The rook's relocation to the 7th rank immediately activates it, eyeing the vulnerable passed pawn and preparing for a potential coordinated assault alongside the queen.